Radio IMWS.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Radio IMWS, the election special on Friday nights, as you've been listening to us now for, I think, about 8 weeks. Now then, on May the 7th, voters up and down the country will head off to their local polling stations with an eye to vote in a local MP and a government. With just under 6 weeks to go, I read somewhere earlier, it was 40 days before the general election. It's important to make an informed decision and use your vote to shape politics on a local and national level with issues that matter to you. With this in mind, Radio IMWS has been given an opportunity for local candidates to come into the studio and give you, our listeners, a chance to ask the questions that matter to you. Now then, as for most weeks, we returning onto the election special after a week's absence. It is my co-host, of course, Mr. Ayyub. Bismillah. Ayyub, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And it's nice to be back, although I wasn't very far from the election issues last week.
Yes, we did mention to our listeners that you were there. Sorry, in Dewsbury Town Hall, I believe.
That's right. It was the National Union of Teachers question time with the local candidates.
Yep.
in Dewsbury.
Yep, and joining us is a Dewsbury candidate. He is the PPC for the Green Party for Dewsbury. It's Adrian Cruden. Adrian, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us in the Radio IMWS studio.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Mohammed. Good evening, Ayub.
Right, okay. Now then, listeners, you will, of course, we will open the lines up very, very shortly, but you can text or WhatsApp questions to 07460809218. Ayub, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, as always, we want to make it very clear that we want to make it clear to all our listeners that Radio IMWS is very much neutral and do not intend to promote any particular candidate or party. However, we will try our very best to represent our listeners, the IMWS members, and the wider community's interests. And to this end, we will challenge candidates on what they stand for and how they will benefit the community.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something we've been saying throughout, and I'm very pleased that when we did the listener special, they actually did say that we have been fair with all the candidates and we have challenged the candidates as well. Now then, Adrian, to start with, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're standing for the Dewsbury seat.
Okay, Mohammed. Well, I'm 51. I was born in Glasgow a long time ago, 51 years ago, in fact. I grew up in the west of Scotland, and I came down to England in the late 1980s for work. I lived in Bradford for a number of years, and subsequently I met my wife and have been living in Dewsbury, where she'd been living previously. She's a Barnsley lass, though. My background, I studied politics at Glasgow University. I have been politically active most of my adult life. And originally I was actually in the Liberal Democrats, but as time went by, I found that they did not really represent my ethics and views. And about 10 years ago, I joined the Green Party because I was attracted to its philosophy of environmental sustainability, looking after the planet, and social justice, which it sees as being vital to actually sustain the planet, that we need to care for each other and care for our world. So that is what has brought me here. I work in the voluntary sector. I have most of my working life. I've worked in housing. I've worked in with people with disabilities, and I currently work with a mental health charity.
All right. Okay. Now, sorry, you wanted to comment?
Well, first of all, congratulations for being selected as a prospective candidate for Dewsbury.
Thank you.
Dewsbury actually encompasses quite a wide area, which includes Murfield, Denbydale and Kirkburton.
Yes.
In terms of the Green Party, I know it's grown over the years. I mean, where do you actually fit in with that, and what are your aspirations as far as the Green Party is concerned? Where do you want to see it go, basically? Well,
I believe that if you take the local area, we're actually very competitive. If you look at the local elections last year, we polled almost 14.5% of the vote. We were ahead of the Liberal Democrats by a long, long way. UKIP, I think, only fielded one candidate, but we have always stood in all the seats in the Dewsbury constituency. We have two of the councillors in the Dewsbury constituency in Kirkburton, and we actually have a parish council in Kirkburton, which is majority Green Party controlled. So the party itself is actually quite strong and growing in the Dewsbury constituency. In terms of where we want to go, obviously, like any political party, we want to advance our beliefs, hopefully win people round to that, and obviously win at least some influence in government and in the political system, largely because we want to change it. We want to completely devolve power away from Westminster. So in one sense, what we want to do is advance and gain some foothold in the political system in order to turn it on its head and put it back in the hands of people. That's been one of the biggest
criticism, hasn't it, for the Green Party in terms of popularity. The feeling amongst sort of voters would be, yes, if I vote for the Green Party, where are they going to go? They're not going to get in power, or they're not going to be elected. So is that a lost vote?
I don't think any vote is a lost vote. I think it's very important that people vote for what they believe in. That's very much what we're saying to people. You get a lot of this for years now, that don't vote for this party or that party, should be wasting your vote. Well, I think that's a terrible thing to say about our democracy, that any vote is ever wasted. It is about a statement about what you believe. And if you were to take, say, the Labour Party 100 years ago, when they only had 2 or 3 MPs, you could have argued the same about them, but people backed the Labour Party as it then was, a very different beast to what it's become. And obviously over time they changed the political system and brought in things like the NHS. So I think that very much it is about people standing up and talking about what they believe in and voting for what they believe in. It would be good if we had a better voting system, but the two big parties are particularly opposed to that. And when you hear them saying, well, don't vote for that party or that party, but you've got to either choose between, you've got to vote Labour to keep Tories out or vote Tory to keep Labour out, that's a very negative thing, I think. I'd like to think that in this election what we'll be doing is talking about a positive case for the sort of society that the Green Party would like to see coming about in Britain.
So what are you doing to change that perception in Dewsbury, for instance? How are you going to change people's mind and say, vote for your beliefs and not for who you think might win?
Sure. Well, one, by pointing out that if people vote for the way that they believe, perhaps we will win, and that we have been able to make a difference through things like the Parish Council in Kirkburton, but also in Kirklees Council. We have 5 Green Party councillors who sit in a group with 3 other independents, and they actually have made some real change to what happens in Kirklees, because, as you know, that's quite a balanced council. So even with just 8 councillors, you can make a difference. So, for example, a few years ago, the Greens got through the warm zone scheme. And although there was a warm zone scheme in various different parts of the country, the big thing that was different in Kirklees was the Green councillors actually managed to get it here free. So around 37,000 houses across Kirklees were insulated free of charge by the council, which has saved the people who live in these houses, we reckon, around £200 a year, and has cut carbon emissions very significantly. It also, for the period that the programme was operating, created, I think, around 40 jobs. Now, that is something which we'd like to see done across the country as a whole, because that would create jobs, it would save people money, and it would obviously cut the carbon footprint, which is something we're very concerned about.
So on a personal level, what are you doing to get into the community and get known?
I'm involved in some local groups. I've been more recently going to debates. We're going around on doorsteps, talking to people. We have also been involved in things like in the town centre, handing out leaflets, talking to people, and just getting their views on things. So it's really just about engaging with the community as best as we can.
Okay, town centre, Mohammed.
Yeah, well, we'll get onto this town centre, but what I wanted to know, Adrian, is Firstly, tell us a little bit about the main policies of the Green Party, because a lot of people see the Green Party as this eco-friendly type of loony party. Forgive me for saying it, putting it that way, but that's what people have the perception people have. You managed to get the first Green MP in 2010, Caroline Lucas from Brighton. She's first Green MP, so you got an MP in Parliament. But tell us, what are the main policies of the Green Party?
Well, we are eco-friendly. That's certainly one of the things that underpins a lot of our thinking, because we believe that the planet is facing a crisis, both from global warming, which, if we don't halt carbon emissions and the rate that carbon emissions are being pumped into the Earth's atmosphere, within the next 20 to 30 years, we will start to see runaway climate change. And the threat that poses is that it's already causing very serious problems in different parts of the world. We're beginning to see more and more extreme weather events. And although you can't link any one event to global warming, there is a clear trend upwards in terms of the frequency of these. So we do want to see urgent action on that, because at the end of the day, if we don't halt global warming, we can argue all we like about society, but society will not actually be able to continue to function. So that on that level, yes, we are eco-friendly, and we see that as being very urgent. But something which also makes that is part of our agenda for tackling global warming is actually about a more socially just society. So, for example, what we would like to see in this country is a big redistribution of wealth. You're in a situation now where 1% of the population, if you look at Oxfam's latest figures, it's anticipated that this year the top 1% of the population will actually finally own more than 50% of the wealth of the country. You have a report a few months ago which showed that just five of the richest families, own more wealth than the poorest 13.5 million people in Britain. So we want to see a big change in terms of the tax system. So we would bring in a wealth tax. We would bring in higher taxes for people earning more than £100,000 a year. That would be balanced by increasing the minimum wage to £10 an hour. We want to bring in a citizen's income, which we're still working on how that would be financed. So it's not a finished thing. But that essentially is about paying everybody who's a citizen of the UK a weekly wage for being a citizen. And that might sound like a bit of an off-the-wall idea. But in actual fact, in a society like the one where we have now more and more technology taking over people's jobs, and you can see that in WH Smith's when you go in, increasingly it's all computerized. If you go to the supermarket, one American study says that around half the jobs which we have now in the next 20 years will become mechanized. You actually will need to do something like that in order to keep the economy just going, that people who will not be able to get jobs in the traditional sense are still actually able to spend things. So we believe in a greater more equal spread of wealth, and we also very much believe in public services in public hands, because that's the other big thing that we're campaigning on in this election, is keeping the NHS public, reversing the privatisation that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, getting rid of PFI and the marketisation of the NHS, and also renationalising the railways and energy companies.
Okay, so you bring back British Rail and the energy companies under the government.
Perhaps not quite in the form that they were, but certainly the energy, in terms of energy, we see that it should become more democratic. So, for example, if we invest publicly in solar energy, then eventually everybody's house, your house, my house, can become its own power station. And it will be able to generate a lot of the electricity you use. When you're not using that, that can go back into the grid. So we actually start to see a lot more community schemes and individual ownership of energy, which is one reason why the big companies are so opposed to it. So we would change that.
Adrian, I think you said raising the minimum wage to £10. I can see the politics behind that, and to a certain extent I agree with that everybody should earn a decent wage. Now, that's okay as far as the big companies are concerned, but your small companies, and particularly your voluntary sector, they won't be able to afford giving wage of £10 per hour to their employees. They would just fold.
Well, people said that when the national minimum wage came in, that companies would go under, and there wasn't really any evidence that happened. And there's two things here. One is that we would actually bring in particular measures to support small business, because we actually want to support more local, small-scale businesses. So we would have other measures such as reductions in corporation tax and abolishing employers' national insurance for small companies, which would perhaps balance some of the costs that they would face. But we do believe that, at the moment, a lot of employment, and there's so many people on low wages and nil hours contracts, that they are dependent on benefits. For example, we hear a lot from the Conservatives about the cost of benefits. One of the biggest elements of benefit costs is housing benefit, and the majority of that goes to people who are actually working. But they're earning such low incomes that they can't afford a house without the state intervening. And our view is that, ultimately, the state should not be subsidising low-wage employers. Employers should be able to see that a fair wage for their workers is actually just as much one of the startup or the ongoing costs of their business, in the same way as buying a table or a computer. They don't go to PC World and barter that down. So why are they allowed to do that with their workers? So I think that a basic fair living wage, which is where we get the £10 from, is the cost of a civilised society and an economy that's fair.
Okay. Well, okay. Now then, I'm going to go to some of the messages questions that have come in. I had a quick look at these. Thank you for sending them in. You can send in your text or WhatsApps to 07460809218, and the line is open 01924 505 629 if you want to come on air and ask a question. Now then, Adrian, I've got some interesting questions here, I have to say. First of all, Adrian, what inspired you into politics, and what are the reasons for joining and standing for the Green Party? I think you've mentioned the first part of that. Have we already covered that, actually?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. That was what inspired you, reasons for joining and standing for the Green Party. I've got another one here, which is, why have you chosen the Twitter handle of, forgive my pronunciation on this, Viridis Lumen 1?
Right, okay.
Let's go with that one. That's the interesting one for me.
Well, actually, Viridis Lumen is a blog that I've been writing for the last 5 or 6 years. So it's not actually directly connected to my election effort.
Okay.
It is Latin for Green Lantern, which really is just about being a green, and the lantern is supposed to be about shining a light into the darkness.
Okay.
So I write about all sorts of different things on there, mainly political things, but sometimes culture as well, and so on.
Right. Okay.
So I've just carried that on. With
so a comic book superhero?
Well, actually, I hadn't actually been aware of the comic book
right.
until I came up with the title. Since then, yes, I have. I need to confess, I've read the comic book once or twice. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Another one. Would you like to see electoral reform from first past the post change to proportional representation? Now, you mentioned this a little bit a few minutes ago. Tell us more about this. First past the post to proportional representation. I mean, what does that mean for our listeners?
What that means is that Parliament and councils, the number of MPs or councillors, should broadly reflect the share of the vote for each party. So, for example, if the Conservatives get 20% of the vote, around 20% of the MPs should be Conservative. If the Greens get 10%, it should be 10% for the Greens. In practice, the voting system we have is called first past the post, because you just go along and you cast one vote for one candidate. And, for example, in Dewsbury, Simon Reeville, I think last time, got about 34% of the vote. So around 2/3 of Dewsbury voters did not actually pick Simon. But he has the right to sit as the MP under our current system. Now, there's various different ways you can do proportional representation. There was the referendum that we had in 2011, which was not ideal because that's not proportional, but that was looking at giving everybody a second and third choice. So, for example, people who voted Liberal Democrat last time, when the Liberal Democrats didn't win, their votes would have been redistributed, so their second choices for either Labour or Conservative or Green would have come into play, and so on. So it's about having a Parliament that is more representative of people, and the short answer is yes, we very much believe that is how things should work in this country, and that is in fact how almost every other country, not just in Europe but all around the world. There are very few examples now of countries using our system.
Right, okay. Now then, if you've just tuned in, you are listening to Radio IMWS, broadcasting live from the Al Hikmah Centre in Batley, West Yorkshire. This is Election Special, and joining us in the studio, we do have Adrian Cruden from the Dewsbury candidate from the Green Party. Adrian, what are the big issues for Dewsbury Town?
For Dewsbury itself, I think...
for Dewsbury, the constituency.
The Dewsbury, the constituency?
Yeah.
Excuse me. Well, there's a number. I think if we take... obviously Dewsbury itself, as I alluded to at the start, is quite diverse. But I think perhaps the biggest problem is that whether you're talking about Denbydale or Kirkburton or Dewsbury itself or Murfield, we are stuck between much bigger places, between Wakefield, Leeds, Huddersfield, and Bradford to some extent as well. So because we're in between, and because Kirklees is such a large authority and very much rooted in Huddersfield, I think we lose out. And that reflects itself in terms of jobs and investment. It reflects itself in a lot of the transport system as well. So in terms of big issues, we'd certainly like to see, and what I've long campaigned for, is breaking up Kirklees. And having more local authorities, if you like. So something perhaps for Batley and Dewsbury, but also building up the powers of the town councils and local parish councils that we have around the district, so that they actually can take more decisions and actually have control over local spending a bit more.
Okay.
In terms of Dewsbury itself, I think the biggest problem we've got, obviously, is lack of jobs, lack of good-paying jobs, and lack of any sign of investment that will really turn that round.
Okay.
So I don't think we can hope to just put our faith that one day Marks and Spencer's or somebody like that will come back and start opening up stores in Dewsbury. What I think we need to do is look to ourselves. So one of the things which the Greens and myself in particular are very interested in exploring with ideas like a local currency, which has worked in places like Brixton and Bristol to revive the local economy using its own means. Now, the way that works is you use some of your normal money to buy local currency, but that local currency can only be spent in local shops. And there's a lot of studies show that when you do that, it actually stimulates the local economy, and that money, the local currency, stays in the economy 3 or 4 times more and has 3 or 4 more times of an impact than normal money or spending money in non-local shops like big chains and so on. So that way I think we could start to revive some of the local economy.
It's a thinking outside of the box idea, and I do like thinking outside of the box. But one of the key reasons, obviously, what we're looking at when I drove through Murfield recently, and every shop, in fact, actually, I was actually looking for a shop window that I could use. I was looking for an empty shop, and there wasn't one. But if you walk through Dewsbury Town Centre, now, of course, it's all in your constituency, there's a lot of empty shops. And Dewsbury Town Centre, some of the buildings have trees growing out of them.
Yes.
It's been, now, as you've mentioned, the Green Party do have councillors in the council. Have they raised the issue of local economies in the council?
Yes, they have. And something which we put in and which I actually authored was when the local development framework was being discussed a couple of years ago now. We put in a submission that for Dewsbury Town Centre, the emphasis should actually be on looking at all the empty shops that we've got there and the empty buildings, because they're old, solid buildings, some of them. And we should really question what we're using them for, or, as you say, not using them for anything. What I'd like to see is us, rather than doing what the council keep talking about, which is building more houses on the periphery, out in the green fields and so on, in the green belt, is actually investing in converting some of these into homes, particularly living above shops and so on, and apartments and so on. And that in itself, as you can see in places like the waterfront at Leeds, can start to bring some life back to the town, for example, in the evenings. In Dewsbury, it has 1 or 2 nice cafes and so on, but one of the things that strikes me is, particularly after 6 o'clock, there is nowhere really to go and do things and meet people.
I mean, the council have put forward some initiatives for landlords to convert their buildings into flats and so forth, and that is happening. But don't you think if the town centre becomes more residential, then there's going to be less demand? I mean, you mentioned, yes, you're looking at food places, you're looking at cafes and restaurants and bars as such, because these will be right outside your front door. But you're not going to have real shops there. You're not going to have people from outside of the town coming in to actually invest into that economy.
Perhaps not initially, but one of the takes I would actually, one of the questions I would actually put is, do we need that or do we actually want that? Because I mean, what tends to happen when you get shops and chains and businesses coming in from out of town, if you're talking about big chains, is that they actually take money out of towns. That there is this myth that they bring employment and so on. Look at what Tesco did to Batley Town Centre, destroyed it. And it has never really got over that. And the idea that you can look outside to people in big multinational companies, which a lot of these are, and that somebody perhaps in New York or Geneva or somewhere the other side of Tokyo is going to have Dewsbury's interests in their heart and so on, or even vaguely on their radar, is quite frankly a nonsense. What I believe and what the Greens want to see is much more concentration, much more investment and incentives for small-scale local business, including, and I think you are right, it can't just be about cafes and eating places. It also needs to be about encouraging craftspeople, about encouraging local manufacturing. One of the things that we still have in Dewsbury is we do actually still have quite a few green spaces which are lying disused. Now, something which the council could do, and which it doesn't have the powers or the money at the moment, but certainly the Greens believe councils should be empowered to do, would be to use that land as allotments to encourage people to grow their own food and change the law so that they could sell their food or sell the surpluses at Dewsbury Market. At the moment, if you are an allotment holder on a council allotment, it is actually illegal, even if you produce far more than you're ever going to eat, it's actually illegal for you to sell that. Now, that's just crazy. And so we would want to see a lot of initiatives to encourage local people to be doing things themselves, making things themselves, and keeping wealth in the town. And that's why, I think that if you look at Dewsbury, talk to Dewsbury people, there's a lot of talent here, but there isn't the platform for people to actually be able to rise up and make that good. So that's the sort of things that we'd be wanting to see happen.
Adrian, Mohammed gave a comparison, a contrast between Dewsbury and Mirfield. What's happening in Mirfield that's not happening in Dewsbury? Mohammed said that most shops, or nearly all the shops in Mirfield,
all the shops in Mirfield were exactly what I was going to ask.
And whereas in Dewsbury, you've got a lot of empty shops. So there must be something that's happening in Mirfield that we're not doing in Dewsbury.
Mirfield is smaller to begin with. Plus, if you look at Dewsbury, we have people on very low incomes now. Mirfield, there are people on low incomes in Mirfield as well. So, creating the idea that it's some sort of rich zone and so on certainly wouldn't be correct. But I think Dewsbury, if you actually look at parts of Dewsbury, we have people living on incomes which are in the absolute lowest level of the European Union's poverty indices in parts of Saviltown and up in parts of Thornhill and Dewsbury Moor. So the income level in Dewsbury is very, very low. And that's where we need proper jobs to actually start to make a difference. Now, there is certainly a difference in terms of the social makeup between Dewsbury and Mirfield, but it would be wrong to suggest that Mirfield isn't without its problems. It's got a number of problems and so on. But I think that the key thing is if you go around Mirfield Town Centre, it's a lot smaller.
We've got two large supermarkets in Dewsbury.
Yes.
Yeah, but one of the things in Mirfield is that you see the shops which are very much enticing a particular clientele. It is stuck between Dewsbury and Huddersfield, if we're honest. There are a lot of shops in Dewsbury. I mean, you've got the retail areas and so forth, and even in Ravensthorpe. But it is actually, you can see that someone's actually seen that there's money to be made there by targeting certain clientele.
Yes, excuse me. And there's no reason why they shouldn't do that. One of the things which is interesting about Mirfield is that I think most of the shops you're talking about are small, locally owned shops.
Yes.
And that's precisely the sort of model we'd like to see encouraged in the rest of the town. But I do think that some of the other things I'm talking about with the citizens' income and with improving the minimum wage and so on would be important in a town like Dewsbury to actually bring up the basic income enough for it to make a difference.
Okay, as an MP, would you be able to influence that ideology of what you've mentioned about Dewsbury, how to regenerate Dewsbury, when the decisions and the policies are made in the Kirklees Chamber?
Well, not all decisions are made in Kirklees Chamber. And again, I think this is one of the things which sometimes are peddled by particular politicians round here, that somehow Kirklees is the fount of all power and wisdom and money, when in actual fact Kirklees Council, who I do have issues with, but their hands are very much tied by central government. So as an MP, if I was in the Commons, I would be in a position to influence central government policy. And as I say, that's very much what Green MPs would be arguing for, that we want to see more investment. I mean, we don't buy into this austerity lie, Mohammed, and it is a lie. Our economy, for example, is, even as the government themselves keep telling us, it is actually bigger now than it was 5 years ago. I believe by around about £100 billion in terms of gross domestic product in real terms. Why, in that case, are we still cutting? Why are our public services and investment in jobs and so on lower than it was 5 years ago when the economy is bigger? Right. The reason for that is that such a lot of it has been creamed off by a small, rich elite. And that is where you need to see change at a national level to influence that policy and make the change for towns like Dewsbury.
Okay, but as an MP as a Green MP of Dewsbury, and we have to be realistic. You guys did fantastic in 2010 to get an MP into Parliament, and if we get a chance, we'll talk a little bit about the differences, the way politics is going as such, with the various parties who are there. But you're not likely to be government at the end of this election. There's a possibility, of course, you have as fair chances as anybody to win the seat for Dewsbury. If you do win the seat for Dewsbury, what are you going to do to regenerate? Where are you going to get the capital? Because at the end of the day, it comes down to that pound sign. Where are you going to get the capital to invest into Dewsbury Town?
Well, if you take the potential outcome of the election, what is very clear at the moment is that almost any scenario is possible. Now, let's take the one which at the moment seems the most likely, which is some sort of hung parliament. So nobody has an overall power, overall control. And so you need to have a coalition of different parties. If I was in there as a Green with other Green MPs, we may well be able to influence national policy because they might need our votes to get whoever the biggest party of the government was to actually get things changed and get things through Parliament. And in terms of how we would fund that, there are two key ways that we believe that you would fund it. One would be through higher taxation, and we would be arguing for that. As I say, such a lot of money has been diverted to the rich that it's not actually being used, and that's one of the big problems. Because with the so-called recovery we've had in the past, that would have been going into ordinary people's pockets. They'd be spending it, and the economy would be moving again. Such a lot of it has gone into such a small number of pockets; it's not having any effect. So part of it would be about doing that. The other thing is we are not scared about actually borrowing a bit more. And, that might sound very counterintuitive because for years now we've been being told we're borrowing too much, there's no money left and so on. But if you actually look at Britain, we went into debt in 1694. That was when the national debt started. And we've never been out of debt since 1694. Now, listening to some politicians, you'd think it just happened 5 or 6 years ago. But for most of the last 320 years, Britain has actually been more heavily in debt than it is now, and even more heavily in debt than it was in 2009 and 2010 during the banking crisis. So, we're not profligate. We're not saying you should throw money left, right and centre. But from the point of view of sensible investment, putting people back to work, which in turn starts to generate tax and keep debts and so on down, and it's good in itself for the economy, good for the people. We're not scared about saying, actually, we need to borrow a bit more and tax a bit more and use that for the common good.
Right. Okay. And now then, if you've just tuned in, you are listening to Radio IMWS, broadcasting live from the Al Hikmah Centre in Batley, West Yorkshire. This is the election special. And we do have the PPC for Dewsbury, from the Green Party for Dewsbury, for the Dewsbury seat, Adrian Cruden. And now we're going to take a very quick break. We will be back with you in just under 2 minutes. Stay tuned. More to come.
Online and on your home receiver, you're listening to Radio IMWS.
If it's haram, then we'll get lots of guna.
Yeah.
It's not even 1% guna, it's like 100%.
This is the Kids Zone on sunny Sunday afternoon, mashallah.
Isn't it so funny how we all walk around, never even thinking of the dead under the ground? Come to IMWS, turn right and come into the Kids Zone. Read us a story, tell us a joke, do qiraat, a nasheed, a nazam or a naat.
If you get this right, you will be known as the first ever Radio IMWS Sunnah of Sleeping Champions.
So don't sleep and near Asr and Maghrib.
MashaAllah.
The Kids Zone, every Sunday 1:30 to 3:30 p.m. only on Radio IMWS. Join the discussion on Radio IMWS every Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday from 8 p.m. Topics include Islam, current affairs, health, legal, education and a weekly program delivered in Gujarati. You can join in by calling the studio on 01924 505 629 or send us a text or WhatsApp on 07460 809 218. For program schedules, visit www.imws.org.uk. If you would like to volunteer and be part of the Radio IMWS team, email radio@imws.org.uk or call 01924 500 555.
Special offer. Hire the Al Hikmah halls from Monday to Wednesday for just £28 plus VAT per hall. For more information, call 01924 500 555.
Bookings need to be a minimum of 2 hours and need to be booked 3 weeks in advance.
Radio IMWS. Okay, welcome back to Radio IMWS's election special. And we have with us Adrian Cruden from the Green Party, who is standing in the Dewsbury seat. Now then, Adrian, we've had quite a few messages come in. Let's get through them first and foremost. Let me just find the ones we haven't done. Okay, how does the Green Party differ from other parties in reducing the deficit?
Well, I think as we were just talking about before the break, we believe in investing to reduce the deficit as opposed to cutting. And actually although that's the opposite of what most other parties are talking about now, it is actually not particularly radical economic theory, because if you go back to the 1930s in America with Roosevelt's New Deal and with Keynes, who was the British economist in the early 1940s, they very much advocated the same thing, that if you had a period of recession, you should invest. That stimulates the economy, and that then puts people back to work.
Okay.
They pay taxes, and that starts to get the deficit down. And the particular way that we would do that is through public spending. So one of the things we want to do is have what we call a Green Deal, where we would invest in insulating millions of houses and buildings across the UK, which would create jobs, cut carbon emissions and save people money.
Right, okay. Now then, one of the things is, didn't Labour actually try to do that, encourage people to spend their way out of a recession?
Well, I think there's a difference between encouraging individuals to spend their way out, and governments doing it. And again, I think this is where sometimes, if you go right back to Mrs. Thatcher talking about the housewife's shopping basket, which I'm old enough to remember back in 1979, that what makes sense for an individual about looking after your money, saving, not getting into debt and so on, doesn't necessarily make sense for governments. Because if you're a government that controls your own money supply, as we do in this country, so we're not like Greece that has its money controlled by somebody else, You need to, at times, borrow to invest and stimulate the economy. Otherwise, what happens is what happened if you go way back to the 1920s. You had governments then which did not invest. They very much adopted the household budget model, and so they cut and they didn't get into debt, or they tried to avoid getting into debt or getting further into debt, and the result was misery. Millions of people out of work, unable to eat, unable to heat their houses and so on. And that is sadly one of the things that we've started to see in this country again over the last 5 or 6 years. People having to choose between eating and heating, people unable to do very basic things. And of course, it's on top of that, we've had this horrible sanctions regime imposed on the benefits system, which has been absolutely cruel, the way that it's been applied to disabled people and out of work people in very, very vulnerable positions and situations. So, we are very much want to see the government investing. So we're not looking to individuals to get
Adrian,
into it.
just quickly, if we're in a recession, is investing going to be counterproductive? For instance, where are we going to invest if everybody's in recession, for example? There isn't many option for investing anywhere.
Well, if you were a business or an individual, yes, you're absolutely right. There's nothing to invest, or if you did, you might be throwing good money away after bad. But if you're a government, what you can do, and if you take the model of Roosevelt in the 1930s in America, they paid people to go and do things which were socially useful, so build roads, build railways, renovate schools and so on. And they borrowed money to do that, but that stimulated the American economy, put people back to work, put money back into the economy, so then it became worthwhile for companies to start to invest in their businesses. And similarly, people started to earn more, and that got them out of personal debt and so on. So there's a virtuous circle, if you like, from the government kicking that off. I'm not arguing the government should just keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing for the sake of it, and you need to be careful how far you go with that, because what you can do, you can end up putting so much into the economy that you create inflation, which we've not had in the last few years. But you do need to be careful about how you get the balance right. But at the moment, our argument is the balance is all the wrong way, that we are cutting in services when in actual fact there are a lot of people in need. And there's actually a lot of money about. Because as I say, the economy now, as Simon Reevell I'm sure would tell you, is bigger now than it was 5 years ago. So why are we cutting?
But didn't the problem first of all arise from borrowing too much when the Labour Party were in power?
Well, without being an advocate for the Labour Party, if you actually look at Britain since the war, I think there's only something like 14 years out of the 60-odd years since the war that the government has actually balanced the books. And interestingly, 10 of these 14 years were under a Labour government. The Labour have actually got a better record in this than the Conservatives. The Conservatives have not been good at balancing the books, contrary to the image that they portray. But in terms of what happened back in 2008, we had to bail out bankers. There was something like 40 or 50 billion pounds handed over to banks. Now, my criticism of the Labour Party at that time wasn't that they'd borrowed too much for public services. It was that they actually handed all that money over to bankers and failed to regulate them. They deregulated them to begin with. Gordon Brown was very much a friend of the bankers. And you had Mr. Mandelson talking about being, intensely relaxed about people becoming filthy rich. So they were giving all the wrong messages to people, and they encouraged all these, Russian non-doms to come over here and not pay tax. The result of that is that, London is probably one of the biggest tax havens on the planet at the moment. So my criticism is that they failed to regulate the banks. If you actually look at what they did, we needed to stop the banks going under, because that would have caused a serious problem. Absolutely. But what we argued for at that time was that they should all have been nationalised, and then you should have used them to turn them into things like community banks.
But then if you're still advocating more borrowing, and we saw the consequence of what happened when we borrowed last time. Lots of people lost their jobs. There were people devastated. Families, were really sort of down under with many crises.
Yeah, but
and do we need to go down that road again, or do we actually do something about improving things?
Well, no. What my argument would be is that all that cutting back, where people lost their jobs, was unnecessary. It was a result of a government programme which said we need to cut and contract the economy, make the economy smaller. So inevitably people lost money, lost their jobs and so on. What I'm saying is that the government should be investing to expand the economy, and that can start to pay for itself. I think you're right, and I think most people would be worried if I was sitting here saying, let's just spend. That would be completely irresponsible. But you need to have the government investing to some degree into the economy to get the economy moving. And the Greens argued last time for what we called the Green New Deal, which was to get people to do what we're talking about again this time, which is about investing in insulation and alternative energy and public transport, so that you create things which are useful to the community, which cut things like pollution and carbon emissions and put people back to work. And then because they're paying their taxes, that then starts to get the borrowing.
It all sounds fantastic, but as soon as we use the word borrowing, you can imagine what goes through people's minds.
I do understand that, and I would just go back to stress that a lot of what we're talking about isn't about borrowing. I did say, and you're quite right, that we could borrow more, and we do believe we've got scope to do that. But a lot of it is about taxing more and getting some of that money that has been taken away from the community and is basically sitting in people's bank accounts, rich people's bank accounts and in buildings, because that's another thing which they're spending a lot of money on, is buying up housing and building all around the UK and all around the planet, in fact. That if we get some of that back for the community, that can be put to
in terms of taxing,
good use.
What are you actually advocating? How much tax should people pay?
We would put an extra 10 pence on people's income tax over £100,000 a year. We would have a wealth tax of 2% on earnings of more than of wealth of more than £3 million. So each year there'd be a 2% tax. We would also very much crack down on the loopholes and the tax avoidance by big business and corporations, which is estimated to be around £120 billion a year now. So although the Chancellor talked last week about cracking down, he was talking about getting $5 billion, which is really just a little bit of fluff.
So you're not going to be very popular with bank managers, are you?
Possibly not, and I'm not particularly bothered about that, because we'll be nationalising them anyway.
Okay. Are you going to scare big investors away?
I don't think so. There's two sides to that. One is that if we have an expanding economy, big investors will be able to come here and invest in fair jobs and so on. But we actually think that a lot of it is about stimulating local economies, as I was talking about earlier, and about starting to democratise money supply and democratise ownership so that it is more fairly spread. So again, just as when we're talking about Dewsbury, we're not particularly looking to big businesses to come and save Dewsbury. We're actually not particularly looking to big business to come and save the UK. We believe that we have enough talent and enough wealth within the UK that we can use that for the good of the community.
Okay. Now then, I just want to get through some of these messages because I've got quite a few piled up now. This was in relation to the proportional representation. Listeners asking, if we change the proportional representation, wouldn't it also increase the number of seats for far-right parties?
Well, it might do. I'll be honest. It depends on obviously their level of support. Some countries like Germany have a barrier, a threshold, so you don't get any seats until you get over 5% of the vote. Depends what system you're using. But the other thing with it is that if you look at far right parties, I think it was Göring, who was Adolf Hitler's right-hand man, when he was on trial at Nuremberg after the war, explained that if you looked at the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s, they never won a majority of the seats in the German parliament because they had a proportional voting system. So they had to have all sorts of violence and tricks and so on to be able to get the Enabling Act, which put Hitler in power through. Goring said that if they'd had the British system, the Nazis would have come to power much, much sooner, and they would have had an absolute majority. So yes, it does mean that perhaps some particularly unsavoury people would have a little bit more of a showing in Parliament, but the other side of it is they wouldn't be able to have more power than they would be democratically due to have.
Okay, I've got another message, more local, I guess, really. What are Adrian's views on increased dependency on food banks? What does he think are the causes?
I think the causes are what we've been talking about earlier in terms of the poverty that we've seen and people losing their jobs and things like benefit sanctions where people effectively are left with no money at all, sometimes for weeks on end. Perhaps because they've been sick and they've missed a meeting or there's been some sort of bureaucratic mess up, or because you've just got a very cruel sanctions regime where the government is doing its best to squeeze people down, things like having to report to the job centre every single day. So I think it's a dreadful sort of situation. And the things that we're talking about with things like doubling child benefit and bringing in the citizen's income would, we believe, do away with that. I mean, it is brilliant that so many people have got involved in food banks in terms of helping other people, but the big scandal is that they are needed at all in what is we are the fourth richest society, the fourth richest country on planet Earth. There is no need for food banks. It is a political choice. It's not a necessity. Right,
okay, I'm going to ask you, but slightly controversial, I might even upset a few people out there on asking this. Are food banks a political move? A lot of food banks have been initiated by supporters of Labour or Labour Party members as well. Is it a political move? Because it all started springing up straight after the bedroom tax and even before the bedroom tax had any impact.
Well, I think you did see some food banks under the last Labour government, but yes, it's true, it has absolutely exponentially increased over the last 3-4 years. I don't blame anybody for setting them up. There is a need. There is a clear need for them. And I know Green Party supporters and people who are involved with them, and people of all, well, maybe not quite all parties, but many parties and none. Many from faith communities I know are involved, Muslims and Christians. So I wouldn't criticise anybody. And I don't think that creating them is a political move. I think it's responding to a terrible situation, which is, I think the situation is a political move by the current government.
Right. Okay, so regarding things like the bedroom tax, the Greens come in, is that something that you would continue with?
No, that would be history.
That would be history.
Absolutely history, yes.
Right, I did say on the phone, because, and I do have to let listeners know, and I have to mention also that this is Radio IMWS, it is the election special, and it's Friday, the 27th of March. I was very pleased that I actually phoned Adrian yesterday, and I managed to speak to him today. I'm very pleased, Adrian. Thank you very much on very short notice to come on. I did say when I met you at the hustings that I wanted to try and get you on. Unfortunately, the opportunity arose, and I'm very pleased you came on. We've got another question that's come up. In fact, we've got a few. Sorry, what I was going to mention is I did say we usually, or rather we say to all the candidates that it's a 9 o'clock finish. We've never had a 9 o'clock finish.
That's fine.
So we are going to continue. Right. Okay, now this is... right. Okay. Questions sent in by a listener. My voting decision. Before I do that, text or WhatsApp your questions 07460809218. I think I'm a little bit out of form with the. We haven't had a candidate in for 2 weeks.
You're doing fine, Mohammed.
Am I? I don't know. Maybe I've just had a very tough week. Anyway, at least I won't say I wasn't in front of Paxman. I'll tell you that. Anyway, you can send your text, your questions by text or WhatsApp to 07460809218, or you can give us a call on 01924505629. The listener asks, my voting decision in the general election in May 2015 will depend on the MB candidate's position on Palestine. I will be more likely to vote for a candidate to become an MP who, and we've had these questions to most of our candidates actually. Firstly, calls for an end of the siege of Gaza.
Yes, very, very much so. And Greens have, in the European Parliament, have been particularly vociferous about the need to end what's the dreadful siege of Gaza, which has been going on for years now. And even at times when Israel isn't bombing and attacking Gaza, the situation is that the Palestinians in Gaza are being degraded by the siege.
Yeah.
I read that it's the use of antidepressants is the highest in the world, especially among young people in Gaza.
Yeah.
And the blockade by both Israel and the Egyptian regime, very much at the behest of the United States, I think is absolutely dreadful. We have argued in the European Parliament for the EU to use its offices to bring it to an end and to support investment in Gaza and to start to broker proper peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a side question, which is my question. Do you think calling it a siege of Gaza is a radical term?
No, because it is a siege. And it is, Gaza, I think a lot of people perhaps don't understand just how small an area we're talking about. Gaza is the largest refugee camp on the planet. People went there back in the 1940s after the initial war in, 47 to 49.
Yep.
And many have never been able to get back to their homes. And more, when you actually talk about all of Palestine and Israel, it's actually territorially a tiny area that we're actually talking about. And maybe people don't realise that. And the Palestinians have been herded and squashed into such small areas, both in Gaza, but actually also increasingly in the West Bank, where we see this dreadful wall that's being built round, which you sort of thought after the Berlin Wall came down that there would be no more walls. But here we see one which is being built, a lot of it financed by American money and by American churches, sadly, that you question what on earth is going on, what sort of mindset lets that happen. So we're completely against that. We believe, and we've been arguing through the European Parliament for disinvestment by Europe in Israel, and particularly anything to do with the occupied territories. And we would very much want to see people talking.
Right.
We don't support violence, but equally we see massive sales of weapons by this country to Israel, which we would want to see brought to a halt, and a real sort of pressure on Israel to talk.
Okay, going back to the listener's question, calls for the protection of Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem against extremist Israeli settler attacks. So if you were successful, would you call for the protection of Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem against extremist Israeli settler attacks?
Yes, there should be no further settlement in the occupied territories. And all the monuments, mosques, and other religious buildings of all the communities, faith communities, there should be protected, and people should have access to it. And if you actually look, the really sad thing, the thing that makes me so annoyed, is that if you look at the history of Palestine, for 1,500, 1,800 years, you had Christians, Jews and Muslims living together alongside each other, largely in peace.
Yeah.
And there is this terrible image of things like the Crusades that you see through the through the Hollywood movies and so on, and then maybe things like Lawrence of Arabia and so on, that portrays it as just being a cauldron of violence and hostility. When in actual fact, the truth of the matter is that throughout the Middle East, people of different faiths have lived alongside each other in peace far, far more than they have been at war or in conflict with each other.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I can't come back.
You've talked about disinvestment from Europe. Are there any other things that we can do to bring, an end to this siege?
I think Europe could be more proactive in actually saying that Europe wants to bring the siege to an end, and actually is prepared to actually try and break the siege. That might be a wee bit radical and so on, but part of it needs to be about saying that we will take practical steps.
Would you support sanctions, for example, against Israel?
I think if they don't bring the siege to an end, yes. Personally, I would, and I think most Greens would. I'm not sure that it's party policy. But we need, the only way that you're going to get a settlement is by talking. You're not going to get it. And I think that, to be honest, this is just as much pro-Israeli as pro-Palestinian. You're not going to get victory through violence for anyone.
Absolutely.
And the only way you're going to get it is by brokering proper peace talks. So for example, on whether you end up with a one or a two-state solution, I think that's for the people there to decide. I don't think I'm qualified to say. I have my own preference, I think, but it's not really my business to decide that. But I do think that the West and Europe in particular has a big role to play in getting Israel to talk.
We've talked about talking. For how long is this going to go on? You've got somebody like Netanyahu, who recently said he doesn't want a Palestinian state. He will actually oppose it. And this talking has been going on for a very long time now, hasn't it? Without any resolution.
I mean, that's the thing. What we're faced with this recent election where Netanyahu has come into power and is putting together a coalition is that he's looking towards people who have, pro-settler parties. He's looking towards, towards the end of the elections, and made a video announcement that Arabs by the busloads were going to vote to get people to go out and vote for him. Then you've got the whole thing where he said he'll never have a two-state solution. We've heard politicians and we've heard governments turn around and say, look, a two-state solution is what we support. And to be honest, we all support that. I've said it before and I'll say it again. We want a world where an Israeli child and a Palestinian child do not have to go to sleep with tears.
Absolutely.
That's the world we want to live in. How can we make that happen? And as you mentioned, there's been so many peace talks without pressure. How are these two going to come together and actually resolve this?
Well, I don't think, certainly Israel won't without pressure, because Israel militarily has so much the upper hand. I mean, it's not, when you look at the statistics, I mean, any death on either side is a tragedy. But when you look at the statistics, it's quite clear. You're talking about thousands of Palestinian lives against perhaps hundreds of, or even sometimes dozens of Israeli lives. And I weep for the dead Israelis as much as for the dead Palestinians. But there's no way that it is an equal conflict, and the way that it is sometimes portrayed as being so is really quite scandalous. Okay. So in terms of pressure, I think that ultimately you will need to look at sanctions, not just on things like military sales to Israel and disinvestment, but actually on other things as well. But I think from the UK's point of view, one of the biggest and most positive things we could do is spend a lot more time lobbying the United States, because Israel, its armed forces are bought and paid for by the United States, and so are a large part of its economy. I mean, Israel, in effect, is an extra state of the United States. It would not be viable if it was not being so heavily subsidized by the USA. So, again, we should use our so-called special relationship to influence Washington to take more firm steps.
Okay, just want to ask this question as well. Do you support the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign? And what are your views on the EU-Israel Association Agreement? Should it be suspended until Israel meets its humanitarian obligations?
Yes and yes, and I think it might. I've had a number of emails about this from local people, and
that's okay.
And possibly some of them are your listeners and so on. We are very clear as a party that yes, we want to see the agreement suspended, and we support disinvestment and sanctions until not just they fulfil the humanitarian objectives, but actually start talking.
Right.
Seriously.
Okay. Yep. That's a very refreshing to hear from a local candidate who's not sitting on the on the border there. There is a current. Listeners sent this in as well. There is currently a rise of anti-Muslim prejudice in Britain and Europe. The vast majority of the victims of anti-Muslim prejudice are women. What are you going to address? What are you going to do to address this in your constituency, nationally, and how are you going to encourage Muslims to report hate crimes against them? Should groups like the EDL and Britain First be proscribed groups? Will a government? I think what they're saying is, if you were in a coalition with the Labour government, would you ask for these groups to be banned?
No, I wouldn't ban anybody. I don't believe that groups should be banned.
Would you, I missed out the last time. Would you ban them from promoting Islamophobia?
I think they should be, well, there are already rules about promoting hate, and Islamophobia is a form of hate. So I wouldn't support more laws, because I really don't think that law, I think it's important that law protects people from violence and prejudice and discrimination. What I would like to see is the existing laws applied more fully, for people to understand them. But I think that the main challenge is there's two challenges. I think there's two ways to deal with it. One is about doing more, and as an MP I would try to do this, but I think it's not just about MPs, it's about a lot of people, working together to actually bring communities together more. And we were talking about talk before, there's always been a lot of talk about that. But I think that when you look at Dewsbury, one of the things about Dewsbury Town, perhaps the constituency as a whole, is that we have communities which actually have a lot in common, but actually very little common contact with each other. So there's all sorts of myths and misunderstandings, I think, on both sides. But, you know, when I talk to people in Savile Town, they tell pretty much the same stories about their lives as up in Thornhill or other parts of Dewsbury, but in a different community, if you like. So I think a lot of it is actually about influencing people's understanding of each other. But also, I think one of the things which is important is that government, and as an MP again I would try to do this, is about influencing the national media and maybe some of the local media as well about how they portray people and some of the things they say that they deem to be acceptable. And, you know, whether that is violence or I can't say I've seen anything which directly advocates violence, but certainly encourages an atmosphere where if somebody's dressed a particular way, then, you know, they're fair game to be insulted or possibly even attacked and so on, then that has to be brought to an end. And that side of it perhaps should be covered more by the law.
So we're beginning to see an increased number of tweets, for example, which are very anti-Muslim. The tweets that says, you know, kill all Muslims. How are you going to eradicate that sort of attitude? Well,
I think, I mean, you've seen anti-Muslim tweets, and you have seen some tweets as well the other way and so on, which are also very hostile and so on. And I think some of it is about changing people's perceptions of each other. I still like to think that most racism, most hostility between people is, in most cases, about misunderstanding and ignorance rather than badness. And I think if you can overcome that, very often people actually realise that whatever your faith, whatever your background, we've all got a lot more in common than perhaps we realise. But the law has intervened on a number of cases where people have been tweeting, whether it's been against individuals or wider communities and so on, if it is advocating violence. But I think a lot of it, if you want to encourage respect, it is about leaders and about communities doing more to actually understand one another and actually sort of saying, you know, some things are not acceptable anymore. I think one of the problems with social media is that, of course, all sorts of people can just go on and tweet away and say anything they like, and you will never eliminate that unless you eliminated social media. And I think that for all the problems that you get with tweets like that and so on,
do you think the law
there's other things which are good? Do
you think the law is not strong enough to tackle Islamophobia compared to, say, anti-Semitism? You know, if somebody said kill all Jews on a tweet, I think there'd be a different reaction.
Well, there might be, and that would be wrong. But what I think is, but that's where I'm going back to the law as it stands, because if you incite violence against individuals or a group, the law already says that's a hate crime. So some of it is about building on what, I mean, the West Yorkshire Police have already set up the hate incident report centres and so on, is maybe resourcing them more, making people more aware of them, and making sure, obviously, that if things are reported to them, that they are tackled. And I would certainly want to see, if somebody was putting something out saying kill all Muslims, that should be tackled, and that should be a crime. That's encouraging people to violence, just as kill all Jews or kill all Christians would equally be just as bad. So yes, I mean it is an issue, and I would want to see that side of things closed down by the police. And one of the things that we do believe is that there's been a big reduction in police numbers over the last few years, and we are a civil liberties party, but we do believe that the police need to be adequately resourced and paid, which again they've seen their living standards be cut, and so on. So for things like this, yes, we need to tackle incidents like that, but we also need to more long term tackle the mindsets and the culture which make people feel that they want to say things like that.
Okay, Adrian, now then, the constituency you're standing for is a very diverse constituency. It's almost as if there's a green belt between what we've got in Dewsbury, where there is a large minority, a BME community, and then you've got the areas of Kirkburton, Denbydale, those sort of areas where there's very few from the BME communities. You've mentioned that there's, of course, some of the in Kirkburton, you've got Green councillors. What moves have been made thus far by the Green Party to try and bring these two communities together so that there is better understanding?
In terms of locally, I'm afraid it's myself and my colleagues going on doorsteps talking to people. There's probably more that could be done, and obviously if we get more Green councillors and more support, then we will be looking to do that. That would be a priority for us. Not just between Dewsbury and Kirkburton, Denbydale, but actually within Dewsbury itself. As I say, when we talk to people, we find very much common stories about the issues that people are dealing with in their day-to-day lives and so on. So, we've got to break down these sort of barriers. Nationally, the Green Party we have a BME group and so on, which has been promoting membership of the party to BME groups. We're actually the only party that has a deputy leader from a BME background. Shara Ali is our deputy leader. So we want to see and build a movement that represents people from all sections of the community, both locally and nationally.
Okay, I actually have a question here which says, how much support do the Green Party get from BME communities? What are the proportion of BME candidates standing as PPCs for the Green Party? I think you've answered the second one. Have you got any candidates standing as PPCs? From the BME community?
From the BME community we have. I wouldn't be able to give you the figures.
Okay.
It's not as high as we would like it to be.
Right.
And we have been actively trying to encourage more people to join us to stand. We have seen a big influx of members over the last sort of 5, 6, 7 months and so on.
Right.
That's perhaps not fed through to PPCs yet.
Okay. Now then, how
is the local Green Party organised, and how active is it?
We are organised along North Kirklees, so it covers both Batley and Dewsbury towns. And then there's a Kirkburton group as well. So it is quite active. It's grown a lot in the last.
So if somebody wanted to get involved with the Green Party, who do they need to get in touch with?
They need to get in touch with Simon Cope, who is our secretary. And who's also standing in Dewsbury West for the council, and he would let them know when our meetings are and how to get in touch. We've also got a Facebook page, and you can contact us through that.
And you can follow Adrian on, what is it again? I can't remember.
I have a website for the election, which is Dewsbury Green 2015.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay. And if you're on Twitter, if you follow us, you'll find that we are following Adrian. So you can be able to find his Twitter handle, and you'll be able to find everything about him on all his blogs. Yes. Yes. But I want to go into the area because the listener did ask about hate crime reporting on a local basis. As far as Islamophobia attacks go, there's a lot of people who do not report them. They might be small things. They might be someone saying something in the street, but the thing is that we've seen through racism that grows to, unfortunately, and I always use the example of Stephen Lawrence being stabbed by 4 men at a bus stop on a late night. I can't remember if it was a Friday night, but it's still vivid as when I saw the news reports come out on that one. what would you do to encourage people to actually report even the smaller things?
I think partly it's making people more aware of where and how they can report things. And I think the other side of it is, as I say, we need to resource the police to be able to follow reports up and deal with them. But I do think longer term, what I was talking about earlier is the key thing. It's about getting people to actually address what's on people's minds rather than...
I mean, with the Green Party, for example, in council, where you do have a presence locally, is this something you'd be encouraging, that the council sets up some sort of a reporting strategy or some sort of a reporting hotline, whatever, so that people can actually report these crimes?
That sounds like a good idea. I would obviously need to talk to my colleagues and not commit them to something, but I think it would very much be in the spirit.
I thought I nearly had a rubber stamp on that one.
I think it would need to be, it would certainly be in the spirit of what we would be wanting to do. But I would get back to the fact that a lot of it, if you are going to, the law is always about a basic floor of saying you mustn't do this. This is as far as it goes. You can't go beyond this. But in actual fact, building a society of mutual respect and trust is about a lot of other work and so on, which certainly I would be wanting to work on.
I think that's a firework. There must be a wedding nearby, nothing more. You are listening to Radio IMWS. We're not based in Baghdad, don't worry. We're based in Batley at the Al Hikmah Centre, and this is Election Special. And in the hot seat, we do have Adrian Cruden, from the Green Party, who's standing for the Dewsbury seat. Now then, Adrian, I wanted to go on to, from what you've mentioned there, it's all very good on a local level to try and get more community cohesion, better understanding. That works, but national headlines don't help. And Theresa May and her speech earlier this week and what the government has done recently. We saw the Counter-Terrorism and Security Bill be passed. It's received royal assent. There's a lot of concerns, a huge amount of concerns. It's very much based upon the whole issue of reasonable suspicion. Same thing as what the stop and search was, and she actually limited the powers on stop and search because it was found to be discriminative against the BME. So, what do you think? What's your opinion regarding, first and foremost, the anti-terrorism laws that have been brought in? Do you think they've gone too far? Do you think we already had legislation, or did we need the CTS bill?
I think we already had lots of legislation, which was more than enough to cover most of what we face. The terrorism threat is real, and we know that there are bad people of all sorts of backgrounds. There's actually been a lot of terrorism going on just in the last few weeks in Northern Ireland, which perhaps has gone unremarked on. That's the UDA or elements that are likely to be associated with that. But I would go back to the fact that the IRA and the UDA, who were a big scourge in terms of terrorism back in the 1980s, were dealt with and brought to the negotiating table, and generally speaking, give or take a few things, there has been relative peace in Northern Ireland since. Now, things like the internet have come since then, so perhaps the laws needed to reflect some of the things around that and the changes that brought. But I think a lot of the legislation we have now is so broadly framed and so imprecise that how it is applied is very often down to individual officers and to judges and so on, about what it actually means and how it's used. And so, yes, that worries me immensely. And certainly with the counter-terrorism bill that's just come in, our MP Caroline Lucas argued against things like the temporary exclusion orders under that, which means that if somebody goes out the country, if, as you say, there is a reasonable suspicion, and what exactly that means I'm not sure, but a reasonable suspicion that they've been engaged in something, say, in Syria, and they try to come back, that we can exclude them. As Caroline has argued, that is so counterproductive, it's beyond belief. One, the person may be completely innocent, but they have no way of proving that because there will never be a trial. They're just sort of locked out the country. Secondly, if they have been involved in something, isn't it best that they come back and we know where they are and you can then engage with them? And, we would look to some of the programmes that have worked in other countries where rather than using the government to bring people around, you work with their families and communities to try and bring people back.
Yeah, I mean, the often forgotten fact is the fact that the biggest number of victims to terrorism are actually Muslims.
Yes.
But legislation, 113 pieces of legislation have come in since 9/11. Is it working?
I don't see that it is. It's certainly...
What could work? I mean, you've mentioned about other models. What could work? If you came in as an MP, what would you be advocating as a plan to combat radical extremist ideologies?
There's a number of things. I think we would want to see a major review of the laws that we've got to try and make them more focused about what it is that we're actually worrying about, what is a real threat, and deal with that. Because certainly there are real threats. We've seen that. We've seen bombings in London and so on. So we would want to see the security services properly equipped to deal with that. There's absolutely no doubt. But I think, as I say, if you look at how broad and vague a lot of the laws are, they are open to being misused. And we have seen that, not just with the Muslim community, and that's bad enough in itself, but if you look at things like there was a little boy who wrote a letter on Facebook about not liking David Cameron, and he had the police turn up at his school. He was 11 years old. There was somebody who was prosecuted because she read out the names of dead British soldiers at the cenotaph in London, and she was actually prosecuted because that falls foul of anti-terrorism laws. How does that work in a supposedly democratic country? So, my concern is that these laws are actually being used for a whole range of other things which threaten free speech. So we would certainly want to see them changed and tackled. But in terms of how you tackle radicalism, which undoubtedly is an issue, I think that the main way about doing that is, yes, you do keep an eye on and you stop people if they're participating in violence or planning violence, but you actually also engage. You engage with what is it that you think justifies violence and argue that through. Because I think one of the things which is very striking, and we had the example of these 3 girls who went out to Syria a few weeks ago, is a lot of the people who get involved are very, very young. Some of them are children. And, at that age, people do all sorts of things, think all sorts of things, which 5-10 years later, they probably are very embarrassed about. And it's not only people in the Muslim community who are in that sort of situation. People of all communities, teenagers especially, often go through phases of thinking all sorts of weird and wonderful things, and maybe some of them not so wonderful, of course. So I think a lot of it is about addressing people as individuals, as human beings, and actually looking at how we engage with them. A lot of the people who have tried to come back from Syria, for example, are people who have gone out there and realised once they're there what they have got themselves into and are desperate to get out of it because they realise that it's wrong. Temporary exclusion orders won't let them do that. It will leave them in the hands of ISIS. So what are we saying to them? Are we saying you've got to actually stay with this group which we are so opposed to, and which is obviously clearly a very horrific organisation?
And aren't they the best people to actually put people off?
Yes, indeed.
But if they're silenced, they can't.
Adrian, what's your reaction to some of the things that Theresa May was talking about not long ago? Do you think it's a sort of a race card that she's using? Like sometimes you get that at the time of elections. They throw in the race card. In this case, it might be a Islamophobe card.
Yeah. Are they pampering towards the far-right votes?
Well, I think, Theresa May is clearly a very ambitious person, and she was one of the 3 exciting people that David Cameron mentioned as his possible successors. In terms of what goes on in her head, I don't know, and I probably don't want to.
Okay. Moving on. The Green Party. Another question from a listener. The Green Party would like to scrap tuition fees. Where will the money come from, or will you borrow and increase national debt? And listeners, you can send. And I know I haven't mentioned it for a while. I think we've been agreeing too much on this show, to be honest with you. But you can send your text or WhatsApps to 07460809218. Tuition fees. You guys want to scrap it? How are you going to pay for the education then?
Well, we're going to pay for it the way that it was paid 15 years ago, when there were no tuition fees. People tend to forget that because we're now arguing between Labour and Tory about what level of tuition fees we're going to have. I was at university in the 1980s. I got a grant. My tuition fees were paid. If I wasn't able to get a job during the summer, I got Social Security. And if I had been living away from home, or I lived at home with my mum and dad, I would have been eligible for housing benefit. Now that's when Britain was, in real terms, 50% poorer than it is now. So our argument again, and I don't want to sound like a stuck record, but it is about choice. If you go to Scotland, where I come from, people don't pay student fees there because the Scottish government has chosen to not charge them and that's not because of any special tax on English people that we keep hearing thrown up. It's simply a choice about how they deploy their money, and we can do exactly the same down here.
And now, as you mentioned, the likely outcome of this election is going to be a hung parliament. We could see a coalition, and we could, of course, see yourself as an MP sat in government. We've seen the Lib Dems. They said the same thing. We're going to scrap all tuition fees. We believe them. They didn't do it.
Well, one of the reasons I left the Lib Dems was because I wasn't sure that you could believe anything the Lib Dems said.
Sorry, how long ago? Just remind us again. How long ago did it?
It's 11 years ago.
11 years ago.
10 years ago now.
Right.
So it wasn't just with Nick Clegg and the coalition. It's been a long-standing thing, and I had been leaving for a while, to be fair to myself. I think there's a couple of things. One is, I think the nature of Green Party beliefs, philosophy, politics is very different to the Lib Dems. We have a very clear ideology, which is about a fairer, more equal society, and within that, about free access to education, not just at university, but through schools and through further education as an adult. We see that society should be promoting learning for life.
Yeah.
And so we'd like to see a lot of resources put into that. Yeah. From a perspective that actually benefits the country, it benefits business, it benefits the economy in the long term in any case, but it is also just good for people to have the time, the space and the resources to be educated. So it is actually pretty much a core part of our beliefs. So I think we would be betraying a lot of ourselves as well as other people if we were to do what the Lib Dems did and renege on that promise. The other thing I'd just say quickly, Mohammed, is that we have said that no matter how many MPs we have and whatever the situation in the House of Commons, we would not go into a coalition. We would vote with a larger party or larger parties on a case-by-case basis, which would allow us to not support things which we don't believe in.
Okay. Now, do you think there's too much common ground between the top three, the main three, or the majority three parties in Parliament? Once upon a time, you could actually drive a bus between them. Has that gap reduced?
Well, I don't think you could get a cigarette paper between them now. I always have called them the bank manager parties. It's a bit more like a choice between HSBC, Lloyds, and our Royal Bank or something. That they argue over very narrow things but they make a lot of noise. And there's an American writer, Noam Chomsky, who talks about the illusion of choice and manufacturing dissent. So the idea is that you make it. The area that you can debate publicly is very narrow. You can't really argue many things. But when you do debate about the differences, even though they're actually very small, you make a lot of noise, so it feels like a debate. And I do feel that is very much. You've got three main parties. They're all signed up to more austerity. The Labour Party supported £30 billion of austerity and voted for the same package as certainly the same objective as the Conservatives and Lib Dems just a few weeks ago in the House of Commons. None of them, I think, are actually going to address things like public ownership or inequality in the way that we would. So yes, I think they are pretty much. You have a choice between them, and to be honest, I think UKIP is a bit like the opposition by appointment, because if you actually look at what they talk about, it's pretty much the same sort of thing, but just they don't like Europe.
Yeah. Okay. We've got in fact, I've got quite a few messages. You can still send your messages in 07460809218. Why does the Green Party want to bring back free schools, academies, back into local authority control?
Because we feel that they have fragmented the education system. Free schools especially are a drain on the economy. There's about £1.5 billion that have gone into free schools, many of which operate in areas where there's already enough school places available, and so a lot of them are actually running in partly empty classes. They're outside local authority control, and of course some of them have teachers who are not trained to teach. So on all sorts of levels, we think that both free schools and also actually academies are very much a bit like what's happening in the NHS. It's a prelude to privatising the education system. So we say very much no. People should be able to go to a local school and get a decent education within the state system, and the state should not be subsidising education that is outside the state system.
Okay.
Adrian, as a side question, where do you stand on free faith schools? We have a number of faith schools in Dewsbury, in the constituency there. What's your personal stance on that, and the party's stand?
We believe that faith schools should. We believe that schools should teach faith, all faiths and so on. But we don't think that within the state system you should have faith schools. We think that obviously parents should be free to organise their own education and so on in terms of things like madrasas or Sunday schools or whatever, depending which faith you're talking about. But the education system of the state, we believe, should be secular. And from that perspective, it is very much about why would faith in particular be where you would see different education as opposed to something else. Because if you actually look at, for example, the laws on religious discrimination, that covers a wide range of philosophies. Not just religious belief, but actually also extends to things like environmentalism and political beliefs. So, you drawing on that, you could actually see people with the way that the education system is being split up starting to advocate all sorts of potentially very narrow types of schools and so on. So we do very much believe that people should learn about faiths, and as I say, we very much welcome and embrace a country with different faiths, but it needs to be outside the state system.
So what would happen to the many existing faith schools that we have that are granted by central government?
Well, what we say is we wouldn't just come in and grab them and nationalise them and so on, but we would work to, over time, integrate them back into the system. So it would be more about cooperation and working long term to obviously address parents' concerns about what does this mean and so on. And what I would say is that we do very much see faith as being part of the curriculum, because one of the things which we believe is that the curriculum should be set locally. So parents would be able to have a big say in what happens in the local school in any case, along with the local education authority, so that hopefully it would reflect communities and what people were looking for, but it would not be a distinctive faith school as such.
So if parents and local people from the community wanted to get involved with the running of the school, to what extent do you want to actually regulate that, going on from what Theresa May was saying in terms of making governors more accountable and have special rules for governors?
Well, what we would have for governors is we believe that governors are a very important part of school, and in actual fact, it should actually be a paid role. It should be an elected role, but it should be a paid role, so that governors are actually more involved in the running of schools. Now, in terms of just how much you would devolve it, there would need to be some national standard, and we would get rid of Ofsted, but have another body which we've called the National Curriculum. National Education Institute, which would be about setting common standards around the country. But we do very much believe in democratic and local control. So it wouldn't be a case of just handing the school over to parents, because that's pretty much what's happened with some academies and so on, although it's often just a particular group of parents as opposed to all parents, so it doesn't always work the way that it's portrayed as working. But yeah, we would want to see the local education authority, counsellors, teachers, and parents working together to see what's going to be best for our kids in our particular school.
And what's your idea about British values, and what are they?
Well, to me, British values are human values. and they are common to all of us on the planet. And I do think that it's not about any particular country. I think that people are basically decent. They care about each other and they listen to each other. It's all the other things that get in the way, including things like talking about values that only belong to one country. We do obviously have cultures and traditions in Britain, which a lot of them I'm very proud of. There are some things which I think we need to reflect on about, are they actually as great as we like to think? But I mean, one of the things which I do believe we need is a lot more democracy. We talk about Britain as being the mother of parliaments, but in actual fact, British democracy had to be fought for by thousands, tens of thousands, and sometimes hundreds of thousands of ordinary people being put in jeopardy to gain the vote, to gain their rights, and so on. And I think sometimes we forget that. If there is a British value that's important to me, it is actually about freedom and people being free to be themselves. And that's all of us, you, me, Muhammad, our families, to be able to live the lives that we want to live in the way that we choose.
Where do you stand, or what's your opinion about multicultural, multiracial education? Do we still have room for that?
Multicultural in the sense of learning about each other. I think that's absolutely vital. I mean, as I say, if we go back to earlier, there's far more unites us than divides us in different communities. People might dress differently or talk a little bit differently or eat different food or whatever, but we're still, we're still the same. We're still human beings. And our lives, not just in this country, but all around the world, I actually find the more people that I meet from different cultures, I had a meal with some people from Sudan last night, and a friend who is Lebanese, their experience of life, obviously some of the things they've experienced is very different to what I've experienced, but their fundamental values and what they're like is actually pretty similar to a lot of other people I know.
Okay. A question we had that came in quite a while ago. The Green Party has always been there on the periphery of politics. The party has policies that are very appealing. Why has this not translated into greater support at the ballot box?
I think it is starting to. If you look at the European elections last year, we beat the Liberal Democrats. We locally here in Dewsbury, actually, we've been ahead of the Liberal Democrats for several years now in local elections. And there was a poll just a few weeks ago actually put us within 1% of the UKIP and ahead of the Lib Dems. So I think things are changing, and I think people are less attracted to or attached to the old parties. But I think that we are a radical party. We are different. I think the establishment, if you look at the media, don't like us. So at first they ignored us. Now at this stage, some of them are spending a lot of time ridiculing us, but I think it was Gandhi who said it, or possibly Mandela. I'm maybe getting my great men mixed up. But one of them said that, after that, they listen to you and then you win. So we do very much believe we have a very relevant message. If you look at websites like Vote for Policies, both at the last election and this election, when people choose the policies they like, most people actually pick the Green Party. We're usually on between 25 and 30%. So you go onto that website and you just choose what you support in terms of housing or the economy or foreign affairs, whatever. And we are nearly always in first place.
If you compare the Green Party to, say, UKIP, for instance, UKIP are always in the news. They're just only recently come about. And is there a lack of strong leadership within the Green Party?
No, I think we have a different type of leadership because we have a democratic leadership. We actually didn't have a leader until about 4 or 5 years ago. We had speakers, and we still do very much operate as colleagues. So, for example, we have the leader, Natalie Bennett, but we also have the two deputy leaders, Amelia Womack, who is 28 years old and the youngest person ever to be in a leadership position in the National Party. Shara Rally is our other deputy leader. And then we have our MP, Caroline Lucas, and our MEPs. We've got 3 in the European Parliament, as well as hundreds of councillors. So, we are more a group of colleagues, and our leader, unlike perhaps Nigel, I think Nigel Farage writes everything that UKIP puts out pretty much, or it certainly seems to be able to change it or have the last word on it. We're the opposite. Natalie can't change what we put out, really, because we're a democratic party. We have our conference. I and other members can put motions forward. If they're passed, that becomes party policy. So I think we are quite different, but I think that is starting to appeal to growing numbers of people.
What's your national membership like in terms of numbers?
Nationally, in England and Wales, because the Scottish Party is separate, in England and Wales we're on 56,000 now. There's about another 8,000 or 9,000 in Scotland. So overall, in the UK as a whole, with some people in Northern Ireland as well, we're on about 65,000 Greens. That compares to, I think it's about 45,000 UKIP members and 43,000 Lib Dems. So we're actually much bigger than both these parties. Not that you would necessarily know listening to the national media.
I mean, Adrian, on that, as you mentioned, your leader, Natalie Bennett, in the last election, went for what we're expecting, to be honest with you, locally to take place, which was tactical voting. She voted for the Lib Dems in 2010. Now, tactical voting is the one thing that I think is working negatively for the Green Party. Do you see that as a reason why you weren't successful in the last elections?
I've not heard that about Natalie before, but so that's.
I think she said it on Question Time a few weeks ago.
I'm sure she was disappointed in that case with what Lib Dems.
Well, she did agree. She did say that.
So, I think. I mean, the other thing I think last time, which might be why she did that, is that we didn't have Green candidates in half of the country. This time people will have the choice of voting Green in almost 90% of seats, including in Yorkshire, because both Batley here and in Dewsbury. I think, as going back to what we were talking about earlier about voting reform, yes, you do get this argument that, you've got to vote usually Labour or Tory to keep one or the other out. And I think what I would appeal to people is that, when you look at the sort of political system we've got, with Ed Miliband and David Cameron having that riot last night with Jeremy Paxman, the main thing you sort of think is, are we really going to have more of this? And so rather than decide, I dislike that lot a bit more than that lot, so I'm going to vote for one or the other, what we'd say is, however you're going to vote, whether it's for us or for somebody else, use the democratic right that, as I said earlier, hundreds of thousands of people fought for over the years to vote for what you believe in. And I think if people do that, you'll see a big change in terms of our support. And
I do have to say, Natalie Bennett did actually say on that Question Time, or that episode of Question Time, that this time she would not be voting that way. She would be voting for the Greens. And the reason she voted for the Lib Dems was actually to try and keep the Conservative candidate out, which was a tactical voting. But one thing that we have seen in Dewsbury, and we saw this at the hustings as well, is that there is a lot. The constituency itself seems to be quite divided. It is very much, and it's, to be fair, across the country, it is very much about voting to keep someone out rather than voting someone in. I agree with you. We should be voting for what we think is the right vote, the right candidate to represent us. And I'd love that ideal world. But unfortunately, tactical voting seems to be playing a bigger and greater part.
Well, I would disagree, because I think if you go back 10, 15, 20, in fact, especially in 1997, you had a lot of tactical voting with people to get the Conservatives out. So you had a lot of people voting Lib Dem in some constituencies and others voting Labour to get the Conservative Party out. But I do feel if you look at opinion polls, if you talk to people about how they're feeling about politics, that people have never been more disenchanted with the voting system than now, and by politics and political parties. So I don't know. I get the sense that people are maybe moving away from it a bit, which doesn't mean that the two bigger parties will try their best to say to people and try and frighten them into voting one way or another. But in actual fact, if you look at what Tory and Labour stand for, they're both in favour of more cuts. The Labour Party, the best that Ed Miliband has come up with is that he will limit profits for private companies in the NHS. He's not said, as we've said we want to do, which is actually end the privatisation of the NHS. So, what is the difference that you're actually voting for in this election between Conservative and Labour, and don't you actually want to look at something different altogether?
Okay. Now then, I want to ask you these questions because over the past 5 years, we've seen this come into Westminster a few times. One is the issue of ritual slaughter. Obviously, the Muslims and the Jews have a particular way of animals are slaughtered. That's been debated a few times, including twice within the space of 4 months recently. And the other issue is the Muslim veil. There's been a lot of negative press on it. That's been debated twice, brought in by the same Conservative Tory MP. What's your view on the ritual slaughter and the veil?
On ritual slaughter, animal welfare is very much at the heart of Green Party thinking. And actually one thing which we wouldn't do things contrary to what the likes of the Daily Mail make out, which we'd ban meat. We wouldn't ban meat. But we would encourage people to eat less meat, both for their own health and also for the benefit of the planet. In terms of ritual slaughter, I always sort of look at it from the perspective that I don't think any abattoir is a place where you are actually going to see animals in the sort of situation which I would feel personally comfortable with. I think that what you need to have is proper inspection. And to ensure that from the point of view of whether it's ritual slaughter or a mainstream slaughter, the animals are actually being treated the way that both these different forms of slaughter talk about, which is, as I understand, with both shahita and with halal, that the animal is killed extremely quickly with one slice, as opposed to being stunned, which is a very, very imprecise form of. There's plenty of evidence that many animals, having been stunned, are in actual fact still conscious and certainly still feel what happens to them. So I would be in favour of much stronger regulation of all abattoirs to make sure that guidelines are being followed. And in terms of the role of stunning and non-stunning, I actually have a bit of an open mind in that I don't know enough to say. And I do think that, but I think the important thing is that whatever happens, it is quick for the animal while we continue to do that. But in the meantime, my Green colleagues and myself will continue to promote a more sort of vegetarian-based lifestyle. In terms of the veil, I believe that people should be free to wear what they want to wear. And so as long as nobody is forcing anyone to wear or not wear things, then quite frankly, it's none of my business. I'm not going to change the way that I dress for anyone, and I don't think anyone else should change the way they dress for me. Whether that is wearing skimpy clothes or wearing a veil or a hijab or whatever, that needs to be that person's choice. Right,
okay. And just to touch on a couple of things there, I agree with you with the abattoirs. Unfortunately, abattoirs are not nice places. I have done articles on certain issues where I've had to visit the abattoirs, and I did consider becoming a vegetarian, to be honest with you. They're not nice places. There's a lot of legislation that or rather, there's a lot of issues.
Bad practice.
Bad practice that needs to be looked at. And I think with the ritual slaughter issue, what's happening is that's been put to one side, unfortunately. Animal welfare should be paramount as far as I'm concerned. The issue on the veil, it has come into Parliament twice. If it came in and you were the MP for Dewsbury, would you be in Parliament speaking out against a bill that would ban the veil? Because it will never be a bill, or rather it hasn't been a bill that says it's to ban the veil. It'll be a face covering issue or something. Both times it's been face covering. Would you speak out for it?
I would absolutely oppose anything to ban people. As I said, so I would speak against it. I would vote against it. I mean, the veil is banned in France.
Yeah.
And I believe there's been all sorts of issues with people, as you say, wearing, you know, if they're wearing Halloween masks. And also, so it affects, you know, it's one of these crazy things which is clearly targeted at one particular community, and again has all sorts of weird consequences for everybody. I don't understand why people, are particularly bothered about what other people wear. As I say, we've all got our choices to make, and I think as long as we live in a country where people are free to wear what they want to wear, and that goes from the point of view of women wearing the veil, that that is their choice to do that. Then I see no reason why we would legislate on clothes.
Yeah, it seems strange for men. Mostly men. It seems strange for mostly men to debate in Parliament about not letting women. That a woman is wearing to remove that item on the grounds that she's been forced to wear that item. Now, in most cases, I know that the women. I agree with in the area of where someone is forced to do something against their will. I don't support that at all. Yeah. But in most cases, the women who are wearing the veils are worried because they've by choice chosen to wear the veil, and they've got a bunch of MPs sat in Parliament debating whether they can or can't. Is that right for that House to tell all these women what to do?
As I say, it's not right for Parliament to legislate on people's clothing. But it needs to be that we have a genuine understanding from everybody that you are free to decide what you want to wear, whether that's you're a Muslim woman or a white man or somebody at the beach or somebody going up a mountain and so on. It needs to be your own choice about what is appropriate to you as an individual. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I read the Hansard report on that particular.
I can see you.
So it's still, I can't let it go. Okay, I'm going to move on because there's a couple of more questions, and we're going to hopefully finish for 10. But your views on Dewsbury Hospital. And the second one is your views on immigration. Those are the two questions that are coming up. So apologies, listener, I've not read the whole thing out. But
well, Dewsbury Hospital, I'm very concerned about what's been happening with Dewsbury Hospital. It is as much a legacy of the last Labour government as it is of the current Conservative government. Mid Yorkshire Hospital Trust is very heavily in debt in terms of the Public Finance Initiative loan that it got, largely to spend in Wakefield. From the last Labour government, or through at the time of the last Labour government, the loan wasn't from the government, and I think that is still somewhere around £80 million that it owns, and that's they're having to make cuts to finance that. So on one level, in terms of the hospital itself, the administrators and the management and so on, there may be things which we get angry with them doing, which actually, in fact, they're under pressure from other people or other situations which they're having to try and deal with. But what I'd like to see, and what our party wants to see, is ending privatisation of NHS and reinvesting in the NHS. We've got our manifesto coming out soon, and that'll be carefully costed and so on, but we intend to put a big investment back into the NHS. And from that perspective, our long-term aim is to have local hospitals properly equipped. I think one of the issues at Dewsbury now is that, if you were actually ill and taken in there may well be things which you would not be able to be treated for, and you'd end up having to go to Pinderfields anyway. And there is evidence that where people are taken several miles away, that there is a slightly higher death rate. So there are all sorts of reasons why we want to see local hospitals, but properly equipped and financed. And with the PFI debt, we would like to see that renationalised in some sort of way, because the debt itself has been sold on by the original companies which lent it to the hospital. They've made money out of that. It's now a Channel Islands company, which they insist they pay their taxes. So I'm not going to disagree with that. But they are making money out of money. It's now absolutely nothing to do with Dewsbury Hospital. So it's a complete scandal, to be perfectly honest. But it was the Labour Party that got us into that. They've got us into that with a whole load of things, with schools and other public buildings. The state, the people of this country, now owe something like, according to The Guardian a couple of weeks ago, £300 billion that we're going to have to pay to private companies for creating assets which are worth a fraction of that value, which is it's an untold scandal. It started under the Tories, and the Tories and Lib Dems have continued it. So we want to see all that done away with. If we're going to build a hospital, it should be financed by the state and run by the state.
Right, okay. And now then, okay, we are, right. a lot of what you've said today has been about turning the clocks back, bringing things back under government control. Private things have been privatized. Tuition fees. Tuition fees becoming free again. A lot of it is stepping back. Is that the right way to go to move forward?
Well, when we say stepping back or taking things back into public control, we actually have a very different model of public control to what we perhaps are used to. So when I talk about bringing the railways back into state control, or education in state control, or energy, it's not. We don't want to see the old big national electricity company recreated. What we want to see is locally owned community energy. We want to see, as I was saying earlier, schools more community focused. And similarly with the trains, although I think you would still need some sort of national railway authority, that again there would be more local democratic control over trains and other forms of transport, cycling, walking, the road network and buses. All these things need to be integrated. So we need to have local people deciding that. You can't decide that from Westminster. So the sort of things which, when we're talking about public ownership and public control, it is the public, it's not the government. It's a very different way of doing it compared to, say, the old state industries that you had under Labour in the 1940s and 50s, which may well have worked for that time, but I think would be inappropriate now.
Yeah, but that would be bringing. You'd also be bringing decision making back down to local councils, as we had to do at Batley and Dewsbury Council a long time ago, in 1971, I think. Before that, so that's what you would want for local people. How would that work? I mean, for example, if you had Dewsbury and Batley, would we still be able to have from local rates, local council tax? Would there be enough money to actually provide schools for the children and so forth?
Well, in time, we believe there would be. You would still have, initially at any rate, a central government grant. Because, I mean, again, this is perhaps something which is missed when people talk about Kirklees Council being able to do everything. A lot of their budget is set by the national government and actually comes out of central government expenditure, around 80%, I think, or something of that sort of level. So, I mean, again, that wouldn't disappear overnight. You would need to have something that was phased. We would, through the economic measures we're talking about, be looking to equalise wealth, not just between people, but between different regions of the country, so that as places like Dewsbury and Batley began to be revived and come up again and so on, yes, there would be more wealth locally, so you would be able to provide more from local sources, but there would still be a national government, so there would still be the ability to provide support to areas where perhaps they were struggling.
Okay, I've got one more message I need to read out, but I will do that just after this final question. If you just tuned in, you are listening to Radio IMWS. This is Election Special, and in the studio we do have Adrian Cruden, who is the PPC for the Green Party standing in Dewsbury. Now, Adrian, you stood as a candidate also in 2010. Was that the first time that you stood?
First time I stood for the Greens.
For the Greens.
Yes, yeah.
So from there till now, you've had 5 years. What have you seen? How have you seen that constituency develop or not over that period? And what have you done to increase your support so that you stand a fair chance of winning this election?
I think in terms of Dewsbury as an area, the town and the constituency as a whole, it has been affected by the cuts in public spending. Kirklees Council is particularly badly affected. So are things like the Citizens' Advice and the Law Centre and the hospital and schools. So we have seen local services be badly hit. We've seen the town centre become more empty or emptier. So I think in terms of what needs to be done in Dewsbury, that has become even more critical. In terms of what I've been doing, what the party's been doing, we have been growing. Our membership has increased rapidly. We have been working through the parish council, for example, down in Kirkburton. One of the things that the parish council was able to do was to threaten to force a referendum when Shelley College was trying to take over the middle schools in the area, and that actually stopped the destruction of Kirkburton and Sizett middle schools, because people were very much against it, and Shelley College eventually recognised that, so they didn't go ahead with their plans. In Dewsbury itself, we've been working in particularly in terms of getting onto the doorstep, talking to people. We have also put submissions in with the local development framework to Kirklees Council, arguing for investment in redeveloping existing buildings and taking empty houses back into use and so on, so that we can start to revive the town. So we've put forward a number of plans about making the town better for everybody and sharing the potential of the town. And as I say, as we look forward, we've got lots of ideas. We are engaging and talking with people at the moment as part of the election campaign. We've been doing that before, and we will continue to do that after May as well.
Adrian, there's a sizable Asian Muslim community in Dewsbury. What have you done in particular to win their support?
We've been talking to them in the same way as to other communities and other people, getting out onto the doorsteps and obviously attending things like the hustings in Saviltown the other week, and wanting to try and engage with people about the things which matter to them. As I say, I don't think there is a big difference in terms of what people need or want for their lives and their community between the different communities in Dewsbury. And I would like to think that as time goes by, while people retain their own distinctive identities and so on, that perhaps we get to a point where we stop talking about different communities and we talk about Dewsbury as a community, perhaps with communities within it, but that we actually have a common identity for the town, because I do feel that we are in a town which is quite divided at the moment. And that is so sad, because, as I say, we've got a lot more in common than divides us.
Okay. I believe there was a question on immigration, wasn't there?
There was, a question on immigration that I mentioned. Yeah, what are the Green Party's views on immigration?
Excuse me. We aspire to a world where we don't need to worry about immigration controls and so on, but we accept that we are not in that world at the moment. So we would keep immigration controls, but we would change a lot of them so that, for example, it would be easier for people to bring their partners here, that we wouldn't have the same sort of intrusive questioning about people's relationships and so on. Similarly, for people visiting, some of the visitors' visas and the income requirements around that, we think are just plain wrong. And we've had all sorts of terrible examples, which I think I mentioned to you before, about, for example, a little girl who was originally from Zimbabwe who died, and because her parents weren't earning enough money, her grandparents weren't able to come to the funeral. It's quite inhumane. So, we recognise that there's a need to still have controls. But I think one of the things which we also want to do is address why people are moving. Because the two biggest reasons people move are poverty and conflict. And, we talk about people coming to this country, but in actual fact, the biggest refugee community, I believe, is actually in Iran. It's people who have fled from Afghanistan. You have large refugee communities and people moving in all sorts of other parts of the world. Yeah. You're starting to see that in the Mediterranean with people fleeing Libya and North Africa, and all these horrible things with people drowning in the sea and being exploited by people, people runners and so on. And it's frightening that we're in a situation now where the EU's response is to remove the boats that have been saving people's lives. That we actually think that it's better to let people drown because that might deter them. And I think not only is that inhumane, it's actually also very, very counterproductive and misguided. It's not actually addressing the reason why people are moving. So we need to look to a world which is fairer, where the rich societies are engaging with poorer societies in a fairer way. So we very much stand for things like fair trade and debt remission, and certainly stopping the international arms trade, which fuels a lot of the conflict around the world. And if we can get to that, then that starts to move us away from a planet where, particularly with the impact of global warming, more and more people are being forced to move. And if we don't do it, you can have as many barbed wire fences and military boats in the Mediterranean as you like. Eventually, that will be overwhelmed if we don't actually tackle the underlying cause.
Right, okay. I want to read this message out. I did come in a while ago. My apologies to the listener. My apologies to all listeners. I've been reading them all out quite late. But I think there's a lot of people out there who might echo this. Thanks to Adrian for coming on. Definitely a party with an alternative plan based on ethics and principles. Wish you all the best at the elections. And that's from a listener. So if you want a listener
Thank
over.
you. Thank you very much. That's nice to know.
And I think there'll be more than the one listener that you've won over. I know you won a lot of people over at the hustings as well. There's a lot of things that are right about the Green Party. And let's hope, on our behalf, we do wish you all the best. The best of luck in your campaign to become the next MP of Dewsbury. And a fine MP, I believe you would become as well. I'm not advocating you as such, but I did say, and I'm going to say it on air as well, at the hustings, I do genuinely believe that you did come out on top. And I think you're right. I think if people voted for the MP they want, or for the party they want, rather than to try and keep the other one out, I think the Greens would have a lot more seats in Parliament.
Mohammed, thank you very much. Ayub, thank you. And
well, many thanks, Adrian, on behalf of Radio IMWS. Yep. Thank you very much for giving up your valuable time, especially on a Friday night.
It's been a pleasure. Nice to hear.
And we wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The 1 hour that is never the 1 hour. That is the election special. I think in 5 years' time we need to plan this better. We do have a 1 hour. Next week we will be back in the chair. Yes, election special will be back on Friday the 3rd of April, which I believe is Good Friday. Now we have had confirmation. A lot of you some of you may be aware that come Monday, Parliament will be dissolved. And that will mean our local MP, the Batley and Spen MP, Mike Wood, will no longer be an MP. And he will be joining us next Friday to have a recap of his time as an MP over the 18 years. And also, hopefully we'll be asking him about where he sees politics and how he's changed over that period.
Excellent.
So that's going to be a very interesting
program, yes.
Yes, it'll be interesting what questions come in on that one. I think it will be very interesting to see what questions. That's 8 p.m. That's 8 p.m. That's 8 p.m. next Friday, the 3rd of April. So there's plenty to come. This show will be repeated again tomorrow morning from around after 10 a.m., depending on what time I manage to get myself into the studio. This is what happens, you see, Adrian. All the good ideas of small businesses and everything else, but when you're running a small radio station, you have to feed everyone breakfast before you can come in and put the show on.
That's what makes it human.
It does indeed. But you will be able to listen to this again tomorrow morning from after 10 a.m. And again, hopefully, inshallah, after 5 p.m. on Monday, as we have done with all the candidates. Next week, back in the chair. Before that, we have got on Sunday. Yes, it's returning. It's returning. Yes, Kids Zone will be back this Sunday. The show that opens up the mic to all our young children out there, and we struggle to take it back off them afterwards. But Kids Zone will be back 1:30 to 3:30 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. Tuesday we've got the Islam program. Wednesday we've got hopefully inshallah ta'ala programs. Have a look on the website and we'll find out more. Thursday I believe current affairs will be back, and as I've mentioned already, election special back on Friday. Until then, from all of us in the studio, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good evening.
Online and on your home receiver, you're listening to Radio IMWS.